Welcome back to another JS Drop from this dot. In this drop, Mike Hartington, Director of Developer Relations for Ionic, will give an overview of the Ionic framework and show experienced JavaScript developers how to use its open source SDK to build mobile applications from the ground up. Let's get started.
I'm so excited about this topic because, we have a lot of intro content out there, but advanced topics are few and far to come by, I feel like. Do you agree, Mike?
It's a delicate balance hit of you never want to go so far that no one's gonna find the information useful, but you also don't want to go so basic that everyone is like, yeah, we already know this.
Yeah. Well, here's to testing. All right, I'll let you take it over.
Cool. All right. So as has been said, my name is Mike Hartington. I am Director of Developer Relations at Ionic. You can find me basically Hartington everywhere. Twitter for the time being, maybe Mastodon as well. Definitely on GitHub, and sadly LinkedIn. It is the thing people try to use. We're going to go over Ionic, and we're going to start from the ground and work our way up to some complexity and go over some of the lesser talked about features in Ionic. But for those who don't know what Ionic is, it is an open source platform for building mobile apps with web technologies. We give you the UI components and the native integrations to be able to take a web app and then embed it with some custom code that we've written. So that way you can then take that and deploy it to the stores. There's a bunch of other services and everything behind the scenes that we don't really need to go into today. But basically, if you are on a team and you do not want to manage your own native SDKs or handling the build pipeline, we can do something to help you there. We are going to focus on the open source side of things, but it is worth mentioning that this stuff is pretty popular these days. We've been around for a while, so we've gotten a pretty good market share between iOS and Android. We're constantly in one of the top used SDKs for Google Play and in at least the top 5 for iOS. So it's a good chance that some of the apps that you're using are using bits of Ionic to begin with. Like I said, we're going to be focusing on the open source side of things, so building an app, customizing it, going into the lower level features of Ionic framework itself to understand how you can achieve certain UI designs, certain functionality with relative ease, just without having to go through all the documentation. So understanding the set that we have here, more platforms that you have, the more code that you have to support. Obviously, we have a project idea comes through the pipeline. We have the native iOS team who is going to build out a native iOS app, specifically using Xcode, Swift, a bunch of different Swift packages, which is the thing. Then you have native Android, which has Kotlin or Java, and sometimes even C++. You're working inside of Android Studio and then dealing with a bunch of Android packages. And then you have your web team and then the desktop team. All of these different siloed project structures all start off from zero code to varying different points where maybe the iOS team has a feature already implemented, but the Android team does not, and the web team is still trying to figure out, should we use Tailwind or not? Desktop team, they're off in their own world. Chances are that they are somehow involved with the native iOS and Android team in their pipeline, or maybe they're doing something completely different. Either way, with this whole structure, we have different teams siloed, not working together, not being able to share ideas and features, and also being much more expensive, highly specialized skill sets that chances are you're not going to have an easy time finding folks to join those teams. With Ionic, this kind of goes down to just one pipeline where you have the project idea, you have your web team that can utilize Ionic and its SDK, and then be able to deploy to iOS, Android as a mobile web app, or even to something like a desktop app through Electron or Atari. All these can use the same code base and target all the native APIs to a simplified JavaScript API. So we're going to look at all of those features as we get along. Now, the way that this stacks up is that you have your app UI, which is all built using web technology, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You can import your own custom UI libraries if you want. You don't have to. We provide over 100 components from low-level little icons, badge elements, checkbox, and other form controls that can be composed together to create much more complex elements that you can then pass along into your app. From there, we then provide a native bridge layer, so that way you can then take that web app that you just built, embed it inside of a native app, and still be able to access things like contacts API, Bluetooth sensors, geolocation, background tasks, all things that are possible with the web, but done differently in native. These are using the pure native APIs under the hood, so that way the permission models make sense. The users can control whether or not you want to enable, say, calendar access, things that the web just doesn't have yet. And then with all that, you can deploy it and ship an IPA or an AAB or a PWA. If those acronyms mean nothing to you, we will look at those. So let's take a look at some of the components that we have. Like I said, we have literally over 100 different components. Things from title, which you kind of need in every single app, checkboxes, icons, range sliders, alerts, tabs components, everything that you could possibly need to build an app, we provide. And these are all fully customizable too. So for some reason, your brand or your company or your project has this very, very specific design need, you can tweak every single part of these components to adjust the padding, adjust the font size, adjust the colors, everything about the component. Now, these go beyond just having a single look. They have different platform designs that fit, say, iOS or Android, and they can hook into system settings to completely change the feel based on, say, a global theming style, whether or not you're in dark mode or not. Things that just native app gets out of the box, we provide as well. So all of this is provided for you. You don't have to do the dark mode. It is automatically given to your project. But if you want to go further and say customize it to be that green color that should show up in a second. Nope, it's in there somewhere in the GIF. Don't worry. But if you want that green theme, which is very specialized, it's totally possible as well. The native bridge is a separate project, which we don't have to get into. Well, we'll get into it a little bit, but all it is this project called Capacitor. It is its own separate thing that you can use without Ionic. So if you are already in say a React project and you want to bring it to native without having to bring in all of Ionic, you can just drop in Capacitor and that'll give you the same native access. And then a CLI, what is a project without its own CLI? That gives you starting points for all of the basic projects. So if you want an Angular React or Vue project, and then a couple different templates that you can start from, where you can build that project, deploy it to the native platforms, manage all your dependencies. We kind of take care of all of that for you. So with the little introduction out of the way, let's move over to the terminal and let's actually start a project. So just to verify that I have everything installed, I'm just going to run Ionic V. This will give me my global CLI. If you don't have the CLI, npm install -g at ionic/CLI. It's going to give you the entire command line tools that we have and help you along your process. So with that, I'm going to create a project, Ionic start. I'm just going to call it temp React, and we're going to create a React and Ionic project. So I didn't supply the is Angular still an option? React Vue is okay. We could totally do Angular. We could do Vue. I'm feeling React lately because I watched the React documentary. So we're going to go with React for now. And then we're going to pick our starter project. So we could do a blank, which is a single component, a single route that gets loaded up. A list has some data inside of it. We have a guided tutorial that is inside of our docs. Then the side menu, which is like the swipe to reveal the menu on the side, pretty self-explanatory. And then tabs, if you think of most apps these days, the tabs-based interface, you can just click on each different one. This one is a pretty advanced layout and advanced feature set, which we can look at a later point, but we're going to start with a blank for now, just to, again, start off very, very basic concepts and then build up from there. So you can see it goes ahead, starts all the project. This is working pretty fast. It's going to install capacitor for us. By default, every single Ionic project will come with the native integration already enabled. This way, when you get to the point of deciding if you want to deploy it to just a web provider or if you want to go down the native app route, that decision is already made for you, and you don't have to go through setting up capacitor. It's already in there. You already have the configs that you need, and you can just choose to add the platforms if you want. We can say no to a free account, and then we're going to cd into the directory, and then I'm just going to open up my editor, and we're going to check it out first. So this project is a standard React setup, right? We have our package JSON. We are using React scripts for now. There is some internal conversations around whether or not we want to keep going with React scripts. And I think the ecosystem is moving everything towards Vite. It is not a bad idea. So, but for now, for stability, the fact that it's very well tested, React scripts are what you get. And then we also provide the additional packages that come with Create React App. So all the Web Vitals and Workbox utilities for a progressive web app / service worker. We do give you TypeScript by default, which is something that not everyone agrees with. TypeScript is essential. If you are not using TypeScript, I don't know what's wrong with you. TypeScript itself just is going to solve so many problems that you can fix before you even get to the browser. If you're still on the no TypeScript, just good old JavaScript for me, go ahead and remove it. You can, but you're doing yourself a disservice. And as I said, compiler options for all the TypeScript stuff. You basically never have to deal with this. But you notice that we have these two files here, Ionic config, and then this capacitor config. Now, the Ionic config is basically telling our CLI what this project type is and how it should handle calling different CLI commands. So to see what I mean by this, let's go over to the second terminal I have, and I'm going to run Ionic serve, which is our simplified command for running a dev server. Now you see right at the start of this, it is calling React scripts. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. This is calling React scripts right here. And if we were inside of an Angular project, it's called the Angular CLI. If we were inside of a Vue project, it's called the Vue CLI. All of this gets simplified because of this config file, because it knows I'm in a React project called the React CLI. It also knows that I have a capacitor project in here, so I'm going to just go ahead and save some config for later on. Now, the capacitor config is a little bit of a kind of jumping the gun, so to speak, where we are getting some native project configuration already set up. For example, it's got this app ID, which is what the app stores use to basically identify every single app. Like you could have multiple apps that their displayed name is all Facebook, but if one of those apps does not, if the app does not have the specific bundle ID or app ID that Facebook actually uses, they're all going to be like, hey, you're not really Facebook. This is how app stores identify everyone. And there can only be, I think, one unique way to identify this app. WebDir is basically where all of our web assets are going to live. When we do a build, Capacitor will pull all those web assets and then deploy it to the native project. The app name's pretty self-explanatory. It is the name that is displayed on our user's home screen. And that's all we really need to worry about for the config. So we'll close out these two and we'll go back to our file editor and then open up index.tsx. It's because we are inside of a TypeScript project, not just JS, it's .tsx because we need to tell TypeScript, hey, you're going to see some stuff that looks like HTML. Don't worry, it's JSX. Speaking of, here we see we got a bunch of JSX. So far, nothing should feel too foreign for a React project, right? We have our import statements for the React DOM, React itself. We got some service worker stuff if we wanted to enable it. I'm just going to delete the comments for now because we're actually just going to, actually, we'll keep it unregistered for now because dev server, and then report web vitals. So all this should be familiar. When we go to the app.tsx, this is where things start to expand into the realm of Ionic. So we'll format here real quick just to keep things a little bit separated. We have, first off, the React router imports. So we're pulling in all of the redirect, the route component from React Router DOM to handle all of our navigation. We're not providing our own API like we had in the past. We are reusing existing packages inside of the React ecosystem. This also goes for Vue. We're using Vue Router. And for Angular, we're using Angular Router. Where we start to branch out from there is we now have some components that we provide that sits on top of those lower level APIs. So we have an Ion React Router component, which basically wraps all of React Router and provides some additional features and APIs on top of that. We have this router outlet component, which also has some stuff that sits in between. This is going to give us this way of having stack navigation. So we could have 2 or 3 different navigation contacts that can exist independently from one another. So you could have, say, tab A has route 1, 2, and 3. Tab B also has route 4, 5, and 6. You can navigate in between each one of those tabs in each of those navigation stacks and maintain separate history. Justin,
Mike,
you have
quick
a question. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I know with Expo and React Native, they have React Navigation, very popular, does similar features. Does Ionic lift and shift any of that same functionality? Is there a reason y'all are opting for, I know we're in a web project here, but if you were to do a mobile project, would you use the React router or the React Navigation library under the hood?
You would still be using React Router because under the hood, this is still dealing with URLs, still dealing with a familiar navigation paradigm where React Navigation is more specific to like pure native components. There is really no URL. There is no familiar web concepts with React navigation, unless I could be wrong. But last time I checked, there wasn't.
There's a thing. It's still not great, but I just had to ask.
React Router at this point is essentially the standard. It's a de facto standard. While there's dozens of other routers inside the React ecosystems, kind of just have to pick whatever one's like the most popular and then hope for the best. Okay. So we have these components that we're importing from React Router. We have our actual first route, which is the home page. And then we got a collection of different CSS files that we should look at. So we have our core CSS that we import from Ionic. This sets all of the main styles, like how should HTML, how should body, how should like all these core elements be styled. We have some normalization, structure, typography, pretty self-explanatory stuff. These are all required for Ionic apps to look the way that they typically look. In fact, let's just for the lulz comment all of these out, or we'll just delete them and save. And you can see our app right here is using a serif font, the built-in font settings for all of the web, and it's not right. So we keep these in because our app needs to look a certain way to fit those design patterns. Below that, we have these optional files that you can import. So things like padding, floating utilities, text alignment and transformation. If you don't want to work with Flexbox directly, you could use some classes that we provide, which simplifies a lot of it. And then some display utilities as well. So that way, if you want to say hide and show elements based on a certain breakpoint or media query, we can just give you the class to do that. I like to think of these like a Tailwind Lite. I often see a lot of people say, how can I add Tailwind to an Ionic project when we provide most of the things that Tailwind can provide you, but without having to add an additional step to that process. Like you don't need to include a post CSS thing in here. If you don't use any of the Flex utilities, just comment it out and delete the import. It's a lot simpler, in my opinion, than having to have post CSS go through and analyze everything. And then we have this variables file, which is going to set all of your theming. The theming here is going to say, hey, I should be using this color for the header bar. I should be using this specific shade of blue. The text should be white when I'm in dark mode. So if I were to say, go to system settings and change the appearance, it's going to use a different shade of blue, but it's also going to change the background color. It's going to change all of the layout stuff here for me without having to hard code it. And if we actually look at that file, it's just a collection of different CSS variables. All of this, so for instance, if we were to change this to FF0011, just to make it super obvious. Now UI components is red instead of blue. And because that change happened so fast, let's go back. And then, hey, style's already updated. So this gets a pretty powerful settings without having to change things at a component by component level, right? All of this stuff can be done either globally, or we could scope it to a component level variable if we want, and we can go over that later. We'll close variables for now. We don't need to get into it, but we will get into this routing structure because this is the part where, Dustin, based on your comments, we can look at why we're using React Router. So here we have our Ion React Router. This is basically the replacement for React Router's own global router component. And then we have this Ion Router outlet. Now, something that mobile does, and actually React Navigation does, is that they let you have different routes and different views being navigated to inside of your app. Where typically in a React router project, when you navigate, you're only going to have one component active ever. So if you're on home, you have the home component active. If you go to details, you're only going to have the details component active. It's just a way that the router works, destroys the other component, and then when you need to go back, it'll recreate that component for you. With Ionic, we cache all of those components. So if you go from home to detail to subview 1, all of those past routes will be available in your history and in the DOM. So that way, as we navigate back, we are just throwing those components right onto the stack and destroying the leading view. This way, you get to have things like swipe to go back, which is common on iOS. Automatically ready, the components already primed and ready to be shown, and we don't have to do any just-in-time rendering of a component to be able to do this. But from that, all of this stuff is fairly typical of React Router. Nothing in here is custom to Ionic. So in the home.tsx, we have our major chunks of what Ionic provides, which are all of the components that we have up here. We have a sample component and then some styles if we want to look at those too. Let's do some window management. And then we'll format real quick. Here we are importing the content component, its header, page, title, and toolbar. All of these are just these low-level building blocks that get used inside of your app. The Explorer component, we don't really need much. We don't really even need it. So let's delete that and remove it from here. And then we have the entirety of our app to customize, add features, add different routes, what have you. Now, this is one thing that is specific to Ionic and our router, or our integration with React Router, is that we need a way to tell React Router, this is the thing that we want to animate, and this is the thing that we want to load into our view. So we have this Ion page element that when we look at the dev tools for this, all it really does is, see if I can make this clear enough, is add a div with the class Ion page. So now, as we're adding a new page to the stack, so to speak, we now know what we should animate. Do we need to animate the title? Do we need to animate the other content? What do we need to do? And what's our scope that we have to work in, so to speak? We have a question. Is this caching the same as Keep Alive? In a sense, yeah. It's a similar concept to Keep Alive. We do some work behind the scenes to make sure that we are not, for example, having things run consistently. So we don't have any memory leaks, which I don't know if Keep Alive does. But it also takes into consideration different parameters. So if you go from component 1/2 to component /3, what have you, if you have parameters in the URL, those also get named.
Thank you for answering the question.
Yeah. So let's go back to our app, and we're just going to keep this down here. We really don't need to worry too much about DevTools. What we're going to do is inside of this content, let's go ahead and notice that we have this second header in here, which is kind of strange because if we have this header up here and let's say home, what what the hell is this header doing right here? Because it stands out as basically not showing. Well, let's go ahead and we're going to render out, say, 100. We're just going to render out, say, times 100. We're going to render out 100 paragraph tags. And if we save, still not showing. But what we are going to do is we're going to go in and enter responsive design mode. And we're going to reload. And now we have our secondary header showing. So as we start to scroll, we can push that second header away and then show the main header inside of this app the way that most iOS apps behave. So this is a very standard way of interacting with the UI. And as we start to scroll, we get the bounce effect, we get the interactions and gesture driven behavior that iOS gets for free. We've recreated that. We had to go through and make sure that this was something that could be supported because it's a really nice effect. And it's something that stands out as being particular to iOS and their design language. If we were to say, go over to, I don't know, let's go to Google Chrome. That effect isn't needed because it's got its own design language for Android. So we just don't even bother showing that and don't even go through connecting the scroll event listeners. We just nope out of that component altogether. You could remove it yourself, but we take care of that for you. So going in here, let's actually delete all of those. And let's take a look at, say, we're going to create a button here. So we'll create an Ion button, and we'll import this from Ionic React. And then we'll say, go to detail. We'll set this up for later on. And now we have our go to detail button basically ready to go. If we were to click on this, you notice that we get the nice material design kind of hover and shimmer effect whenever you click. If we were to say, go on to an iPhone, it looks like an iPhone button. Nothing too groundbreaking here. Where we start to have some pretty fun details is if we say go to use this router link prop, we can say go to detail, which is going to push us, allow us to create a link inside of our app. So if we come over here, we should be able to inspect. And now bring up the DevTools again. Should now be able to see that we have an href and an anchor tag rendered inside of this button, which is good for a few reasons. One, because now we can just tab inside of our app and we would be able to use assistive technologies to be able to navigate inside of our app. But how many times do you ever want to have something that is technically not a button do something that a button is doing, or not an anchor tag and use something that do some kind of navigation? This is making sure that all of our stuff is, can open link in a new tab or open things in a proper window management without having to recreate all that stuff ourselves. Yeah, A11D for the win. So all that said, let's go ahead and add that new route. And just to be lazy about it, we're going to render the same thing, but just change the URL. So we'll render a new home component. And then let's go over, and then we'll go to the home page. Now, you can see the navigation happening. You can see the animation. It feels like an iOS app. We can even do the swipe to go back. Pay no attention to the select. That is a me issue. you can start to see like that gesture between the shadow that is happening on the active page starts to dissipate, and we start to get a page that feels like it's on the same level. If we were to go home to, we'll go to Mac OS and go back to the home page, we get a very different animation style that feels like Android, feels like a material design animation. The interesting thing with Android and material design is that they have very different animations depending on what OS you're using, what device you're using, due to just Android being Android. So we kind of had to pick one that worked well enough, and I think this is a pretty decent example. But from here, we can now pass in more information. So for instance, I believe it is, go ahead and pass in an ID. We're just going to pass something in along, and we're going to go ahead and we'll pass in, say, 1. So as we go in, we're able to pass in the detail and have dynamic slug. So as we go back and forward into that animation, that is also getting passed in. And we can access that stuff too by going and using the routes use ion router. That no, it is the use params. And we'll add the import from React Router and rename that to params. So we could say inside of here, we'll just render paragraph tags. Params are, and let's say JSON.stringify params null and 2. So now let's see, we'll go in here. Params are nothing because we don't have anything passed in, but now we get access to all of them. So the way we access that data, the way we access all the route information is not going to change if you've used React Router before. All that knowledge and all that information is still super valuable. Before I go on, are there any questions? Okay, let's extract all of this for now. And we are going to pull this into a new component. We're going to pull it into a new page. That way we actually have a proper detail page. And you can see inside of our structure, we separate concepts of things that are components, things that get rendered inside of a page, and things that are full screen UI level controls. So home is obviously its own kind of full level route, and then components get rendered in here. We can almost think of this like layouts in, say, Next, Nux, some of these more server-side rendered things, in the sense that these get used to render other things, but we can also render out, say, the header, more granular controls. So it's not 100%. I would say it's like an 80% similar concept. So let's go ahead and we're going to add a new node here. We'll call it detail.tsx, and then paste this. Oh yeah.
Yeah, sorry, because you kind of went down that route. Like, how would you're saying it's similar to the Next Nux router? If you were to be using Next Nux and then trying to combine it with Ionic, is that how does that work?
So there is a Nux Ionic integration that is built out by the Nux team, which works really well. We actually have a blog post on the Ionic blog about it. As far as Next goes, there is some There's some caveats to it. I haven't tried it in a bit. As far as I know, we basically used it as a way to just export everything out afterwards. We didn't use any of the server-side concepts that Next had. But for Nux, for all the Vue fans, that works out of the box, no issues.
Awesome, thanks.
Cool. So let's just fix this up real quick. All this detail. That looks good. And then instead of rendering home, we'll render detail and then import it. So cool. Now we have the two different routes that we're navigating to, home and detail, and they are proper. Different routes. In fact, if we open up our DevTools again, we can see the caching concept that is used here. So here's our home page. Let's go to detail. Now we can see the work happening behind the scenes. Page gets hidden. It's more or less removed from the DOM. Screen readers can't access it. They can only access this main page that we have active. As soon as we go back, we remove that that detail component from the stack, and we keep the home page active, removing any of the hidden attributes for ARIA and making sure that it is front and center. So if we had a stack of maybe 4 or 5 different components, the same thing would happen. We could just pop back to the previous one without having any issues. Inside of the detail, though, it would be nice, considering that we are on a desktop, we can use these buttons. We don't have that in a mobile context, so we need to add those in. There's some cases where you don't want those, so we don't give it to you by default, but they're pretty easy to add. And we can do that inside of this primary header. So let's make sure we use a few different components here. We're going to use Ion buttons, and then we're also going to use an Ion back button. Now let's just add the imports for these first. Ion buttons is essentially a wrapper component. For instance, you could have multiple buttons here, and we want to make sure that they all get laid out correctly, which is along the horizontal axis. Buttons allow us to do that and maintain the layout and the flex of the title. Since we only need one, we can delete it, but we can also control where this button gets rendered. So let's just render it for now, and let's go to the detail page. You can see it's rendered below the title, which could be a design paradigm that you want to use. Probably not, though. You're probably going to want to have this button be rendered right next to the title, which is how Material Design likes your tab bars or your app bars to behave. So to do that, we can make use of this slot property, and we're going to set this start. Now, slot is not something that we built into Ionic. We make use of web components, and you might have seen it inside of the DevTools a little bit, this shadow content. So this is where we can peel back a layer of the onion and start to look at the internals of Ionic's components. Let's go into this header bar, and we're going to expand into the toolbar. We had this shadow content. We had the toolbar container, and then we have all of these different internal slots that we can use to control layout. This is all part of web component spec. So all the things that we are seeing being rendered here are web components. But what we render in here inside of our React app is React component. So how this works is we have a collection of React components that get rendered inside the React context. All of those React components are essentially just placeholders for a web component. It's how we make sure that React understands these attributes or properties. These are React props. These events that can be emitted from our components that are custom events that we've written. Here are the React props equivalent. So what could be ion change inside of an input now becomes on ion change inside of a React context to make sure that everything works well together and fits into the same mental model. So again, this is just a web component. All of these things are just web components that get rendered and work well with inside of a React context. So we're using this slot. We're going to say render this at the start position. So that gets rendered right here, right next to the content. We have a secondary position as well, a primary, and then this really interesting one called end. We could have called this left, and we could have called this right. Free guess, just shout it out. Why did we not use start and right, left and right?
RTL.
It's like you know the answer beforehand. Yeah. So let's actually save this to make sure that this is in the correct position. Did I mess that up? I did. I messed that up. Put that inside of the toolbar, not just the header. And yeah, here we go. We have the detail component being rendered here. Now let's just do this, and we will add an attribute. Dir equals RTL. Actually, I think I might need to actually do it on the index.html. And here we go. We are in the home page. Go to detail. Now the layout completely supports right to left layout without you having to change any of the concepts. So start might work. Start's going to work on the left side for left to right, and right on the right to left. We would change that to end. Concepts would still work the same, and everything would just work as expected, which there's a surprising number of languages that are right to left that you don't even think about until it becomes an issue. This is already baked into it, so that way you don't need to deal with that yourself. And then let's just go back, and we'll go back to left to right. And then we'll move this back to the start side. And then here we go. Inside of detail, everything's working great. Now, this should be working perfectly, but let's go ahead and do something that it's not necessarily possible in a native app, but we're going to do it in a web app. And that's do a hard reload. We've lost our back button. We have no way to go back to the home page. What do? The same situation could also happen inside of an app if, for instance, you have push notifications, right? You want to send users to a deeply nested route inside of your app, and they might not get the context of all the history that they should go back to. Thankfully, we've thought about this, and we have a property on this back button called default href. Default href is basically going to say, hey, if I land on this page and I have no history in like memory, go back to a route. We can make this whatever we want, but we're just going to go into basically the root of our project. So we'll save, detail, the home button automatically comes back, and boom, we are back on home page. See what we got in chat. I am not keeping up with any of these comments. Glad to see you all like the right to left stuff. Holy deep link coolness, Batman. Yes. So Going on from here, let's take a look at some of these theming capabilities, because the theming capabilities are one of the things that I love the most. And what we can do is introduce a few more components. And we're going to do this on the home page. I'll make sure I'm on the right thing. We're going to introduce a card in Ion card content. And then another Ion button. It just says, click me, no actions or anything needed. And let's just update these imports. And then we'll save. And now here we are. We'll just delete the router link on the detail button just to make sure any accidental clicks do not go through for now. And we can see we have now 2 buttons that are scoped to this page. Let's open up the home.css, and we're going to start to modify how these buttons can be themed. So inside of here, we could just say, well, first, let's give this a scope. So we'll say class equals homepage. And let me just make sure that that actually shows up correctly. Yeah. We have the homepage component here. We are going to go ahead and first homepage, and we'll set Ion primary. Well, let's not try to guess. We're just going to get that. And we're going to rewrite this blue to be our FF0011 again. What broke? React making me feel like a fool. Class name, not class, because it's 2023. Anyway, so we have now rethemed our entire color of primary to be this red. And actually, if we were to go back in, we'll just add router link detail.1. We'll add that router link again. Turns out we did need it. We've now had a CSS variable change happen, but only scoped it to a particular page. This becomes super powerful if you have something that just needs to be adjusted on a one-off context, but you don't want to make the change globally. It becomes super powerful and super easy to do using these variables. Let's close this and let's do a quick little window management. In the home page, we can drive this even further by saying Ion card, Ion button, and delete that altogether. And now we can only change the variable anytime we're inside of this Ion card. But we can go even further, right? These variables are changing top level things. But what if we just wanted to change the button altogether and not affect the rest of the component? I mean, obviously, we could do something like this, where we change it on the button basis, but we could also do it in a different way. We could look at the button itself, open up our dev tools, and then start to look at some of the other CSS variables that get exposed on this Ion button. So we have all of these different colors here, right? We have a background activated, a background hover. We have all of this CSS variables at our disposal. Let's change this to just be background. Now the background gets set and we have a different look and a different color based on that variable. There's several different ways that we could do the same thing, which can be confusing. So on a team, you're going to want to communicate how you want to change these variables. The thing that I highly recommend is that if you are changing something at a global context, only change it inside of the variables file and change it at the root. Otherwise, use the component specific variables and change that one particular instance. If it just needs to be a one-off thing and you just need to modify that, do those variables. We have a great question. If another component has a similar class name, will it also be affected? Yes, it will be, which is why you want to scope these to some higher level class. So in Vue, for instance, because you can scope the CSS to that particular component, you don't need to worry about it too much. Same thing in Angular, you have this host selector that is specific to the component. If we were to, because this is React, we could delete this homepage selector, and now it's going to affect every single component. I don't know why I did it there, but there's different ways that this can be included in your app that is going to have a cascade. So now we're dealing with CSS cascading. That's a whole nother workshop altogether. Try to be as specific with React in particular. Otherwise, things get wild. It just happens to be the nature of how React works. You could use something like a CSS and JS library, like Emotion. I'm not that familiar with the particular libraries that people would want to reach for, but you can make use of those libraries to create one-off components and just modify those CSS variables inside of that one reusable instance. So that could be one approach that you could take. Again, this is just a team decision that you would need to discuss amongst one another and figure out what's our strategy going to be for this. Now, I don't need to go in here and select all of these elements to kind of find out what variables get exposed. I can actually just go to framework docs, so ionicframework.com/docs. And if we were to go to, we'll go to the button because we're using it. We can go to our theming, and we can see all of the different ways that you can theme the button itself. So we can even have a whole bunch of stuff in here. Let's actually go in and we'll just change and copy this. And we're going to drop that in there. And now all of our buttons are using this nice little retro UI and design, but using every single possible CSS variable that the button exposes. So if you get stuck in for whatever reason, you're like, oh, how do I change this one thing because it's not working as I would expect? Ionic docs, and then you have this whole list of custom properties that you can modify to fit your needs. There are some parts of the component that we do try to keep private. For instance, if we were to look at this button, you can see inside the shadow content, we can look at, say, this button inner, the text, and this ripple effect. We don't really expose those because we treat these as the private API that we as the maintainers care about. And we try not to make sure that you can affect those, because if we need to make a change that is a breaking change, we'd like to not break your apps. Go figure. So there are certain parts that we try to keep internal to the framework and internal to the component logic. But you can see that there's a part in here If you've never heard of CSS custom parts, it's basically a way to expose the internals of something in Shadow DOM out to the user. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a new rule. We'll just delete all this, and we are going to customize this internal. So let's go ahead. We'll save this just to be sure. Yep. We're going to select the part, and it is native. And we'll say color is red. And now all of the internals are red without having to do like any deep customization. Because typically this stuff would not be exposed. Like if we were to just to select Ion button and then .native to select something internal of this button, like that doesn't work because of Shadow DOM. But using the part API, we can actually target all of these things. And if you are curious and want to read more about it, we have a whole theming section that goes over CSS shadow parts and kind of gives you a nice little primer on what shadow parts are. They have a super cool name, but a very simple API. So it is a lot cooler because of its name. Now, from here, if we want to just ship this to our app, we're actually going to delete the shadow part because we don't really need it. If we want to ship this to a native app, we can start to work with some of the capacitor tools and capacitor APIs. So what I'm going to actually do is stop our dev server. And in the new terminal, I'm going to add, because I know I have the SDK set up, I'm going to add the iOS platform. Now to do that, we can use Ionic cap, which is just a short way to say capacitor, platform add iOS. Ionic cap add iOS. I forgot we simplified it. Which is going to go through, install the iOS platform. It's going to create the native project for us. So if we were to look at our project structure, we now have a brand new iOS folder in here, which is using Xcode workspaces. It's going to be a full native project. You'll notice we get this little warning here. We could not sync your web assets with the native project. Fairly simple. We're just going to do an Ionic build, which is going to be called React scripts build. So your standard React build process. It'll generate everything for us. And then we can do Ionic cap sync iOS, and it'll do the build again. And then sync all of those native assets, like our status bar, keyboard, haptics, and then app information with the native project. So Dustin had mentioned a project earlier called React Navigation. Now, React Navigation, aside from using a different navigation paradigm, it also makes use of native iOS and Android libraries under the hood to manage navigation, to manage linking what is essentially a React native component with the native UI controllers inside of iOS and Android. That native code is an important part of that project and needs to be linked from your node modules to your native project. We also have a section that's kind of like that, where all of these plugins depend on some native code. Status bar is going to be used so that way we control the look and layout of the status bar. Keyboard is going to be used to look and control the interactions with keyboard, haptics, app. All these are requiring some sort of native code. And they could also include some native dependencies. If you have a third-party capacitor Firebase plugin, right? There's a whole slew of Firebase SDKs that could be a dependency of that native project. Well, the way that we manage this is by making use of CocoaPods for iOS specifically. CocoaPods is their way of managing external dependencies. Android has Android libraries, and I believe it is Maven as one of their repositories for where you can pull third-party code. Android has a few different options that you could also use, but you have a way to specify external dependencies that should get brought into your project. Well, we can make use of that using CocoaPods, and then when we go to actually, let's just look at it. We're going to look at the haptics plugin, and then in iOS, we will look at actually it's in the pod spec. You can see all the resources that it is including, all of the native code that we want to include, and then the native iOS project is going to have a way to link those dependencies together. So let's just open up Xcode. Xcode can be scary. It's not that scary anymore. But if you've never used it, it's like old school iTunes, but for native app. So we're going to open up using capacitor open iOS. It'll open up our workspace, which has references to different files. Yeah, I'm not wrong. You look at this. This looks like the now playing element from old school iTunes. So we open up our workspace, which has two different projects in here. We have the actual app project itself, which we could expand. Look at the app delegate file over here. So apologies for the super bright UI. I have not modified this to
Can we like increase the font a little bit?
See if we can do
possible?
that. Like I said, I have not updated any.
No command plus. Oh,
and like my eyes are super bad, so like I need at least size 24 font. Anyway, we have all the native code in here. It's not too important what any of this is doing, but if you did need to say modify how the native apps like interacts with different native code, like you could interact with that. When the app comes back from being in the background, when the app receives a notification, all these can be handled inside of this app delegate. I mean, we even have access to the main storyboard, which is something that you'll probably not want to modify, but you do have full access to the native controls in all of these elements. You can even make your own little launch screen storyboard with a custom icon. The CocoaPods, as I was mentioning, here we can see how we're installing all of these, and it is, I wouldn't say it's a hack, but it's a really, really clever approach to doing it. All of these pods are being added and referenced through relative roots to the node module. So any custom third-party API that we would want to integrate with, we have a really simple way to reference that and add it in there without having to have a blessed set of third-party packages, which I know is something that does exist in other ecosystems. You can only use certain ones because they integrate with specific tools. We have no limitation for that. Inside of the app itself, we have the main assets in here. For instance, we have our JavaScript, which gets generated from our main build. All of this is obfuscated code. We don't really need to worry about it, but let's go ahead and then do a main build, and we're going to deploy it to our simulator. So we've had our app created. It's doing a very, very basic navigation. Let's get this loaded up on the simulator. And we'll give it a moment to boot up. good to know that
Yeah.
the iOS simulator has never been fast. So this is to be expected. It was actually a really, really quick launch. Dustin, you had a question.
No, I was about to make the same comment. I was like, man, this is pretty quick considering the history. You
Yeah.
you risked it.
I risked it. I did an npm install, so I was feeling lucky. But here we have our entire app. We can still go to the details. We can do our swipe to go back, and you can see the interactions as the back title becomes now the previous page title. All of this is pretty nice. What becomes super cool here is now we have access to this from the simulator. And if we wanted to, we could do all of our debugging, all of our inspecting, all of our customization right here from the native app. And all this is just going to be, let's go ahead, click the inspect. Let's go ahead and inspect this button. Now we can open up the panels and we can start to modify this whole process and work directly from the simulator. But what's cooler than that? Never having to open up Xcode to begin with, which is something that I am a fan of. So instead of doing that whole process going through Xcode, let's just go ahead and do Ionic cap run iOS. And then we're going to pass in two CLI flags, live reload and external. Live reload, self-explanatory. Start the dev server. External, if we are because of some permissions with network and networking and native iOS, we need to expose this IP. So that way, if we want to request something from a different origin, we could, or we could just start this dev server and then actually inspect it on our device remotely. So we're going to run that. It's going to prompt us to pick what device we want to deploy to. And I believe 14 Pro. We'll select that one. It'll go through, do a quick little build, sync our assets, expose the IP that we want to deploy from, and then it's going to run this run iOS command and then target the specific simulator for us. So we'll give it a moment, let React scripts do its thing. This is doing a full native build behind the scenes, which is done in 18 seconds, which that was fantastic. That was so fast. And now back inside of our editor, let's go back to our homepage again and let's update this blank title to actually be home. And now we have a faster development cycle. We can start accessing things like the file system, Bluetooth, just through JavaScript, and then have it be deployed to those devices and still have the same experience that we should be used to as a web developer, which is very, very powerful. Question, I assume that iOS build only works when you are on Mac. Yes, if you want to do anything iOS, you do need a Mac. I just had an iOS simulator and Xcode set up. I would have done Android normally, but well, we had 18 seconds for an iOS build. It would have been at least double that for Android. Shots fired for Android, folks. But this also includes things like, let's go to dark mode. Now we can start to modify all of this code on device without ever having to open up the DevTools or opening up the browser. And even if we wanted to, we could still go to the browser and still have this app open up here and then also have it open up in the DevTools. So we have a faster development cycle, faster time to market, and simpler code to maintain and manage. All of our features can be implemented from one code base onto the different platform. So I'm going to stop here for a second. Anyone have any questions? No. Okay. Well, great, because we've covered basically everything. We've gone through this whole entire process. If we had any other questions, or we had people
There's a question. Can I unify the UI design system, Material UI, or Cupertino across the different OSs?
That is a really good question. Yes, you can. So if we were to go to this app TSX and say we wanted to make this be material design on iOS, which I'm not a fan of, but I guess you could. We actually expose some top level theming capabilities that will set that specifically for a global context. So now inside of our app, we are using the material UI look and feel. In fact, let's just open up the dev tools to make sure that this is correct. Sometimes they need a full refresh for certain components, but normally it should just work. And now we have material mode on iOS, which, sure, you can do that. I don't think this is a thing that you should do, but people might want that. Is it possible to...
Go ahead. You were reading it. I was just going to read it for you.
Okay. Is it possible to integrate with some static page generators like Gatsby? Would we lose the page change animation? I don't know about Gatsby. I have not worked with Gatsby in years. But as I said, Nuxt, Ionic is possible to do all of this, and it can generate all of this stuff for you. This is not supported by us officially. This is supported by the by the Nuxt team. So that would be one route if you want to go and learn some Vue. Any other questions?
Can you demo the Android experience?
I can give the Android experience a shot. You are testing fate right now, but let's try that.
Hey, we tested fate getting an iOS emulator up.
That is very, very true. Well, let's try that. So the process for Android would be very similar. Ionic cap, add Android. It'll go through, install the package, create the native project for us. It'll update any Android dependencies that we might have. This might take a little bit longer because Android libraries have been a bit sketchy the past couple days.
Well, there's another question that we can ask while we're waiting on the install, which I think I'm going to expand the question, if that's okay with you, Adam, which is, does Ionic have any plans to expand beyond Angular, React, and Vue currently? We're seeing a big rise in popularity with Svelte, Solid.js, and Svelte. So I think I said Svelte twice. Quick. Thank you. I knew I forgot one. We're seeing rising popularity with those three. Does Ionic have plans to create compatible components and libraries and integrations with those technologies?
At the moment, no. We do have some ambitious community members who are trying to go ahead and add Svelte integration and have seen a lot of success. So much so that we've created our own dedicated Ionic Svelte channel on Discord. So that way people could join our server, jump into the Svelte channel, and start to ask questions around that if they wanted to. Solid, quick, no tentative timeline for any of those. I think with Angular, React, and Vue, we've got our hands full already. It's a lot of frameworks to support. And anytime we do want to add another framework that we would want to support, it's a lot of evaluation of, is this something that is a fad, or is this something that is going to have some long-term support and growth? So we have a few other questions. Can I deploy and test my app on a mobile device like you can with React Native and Expo? Yes, you can. If you actually connect your device just through USB, you can deploy right to that native device. Let's just get the Android part done. Cap, open Android. Here, Trust project.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, right? I do know that it won't work fully because I do not have any devices or emulators set up. But we got to this point, which is better than I thought it was going to be. This is a new computer, so I have not gone through and done everything yet. So bear with me.
Well, you
But
can
at
totally
least-
pause it there, given the time constraints left. So,
And there
We
is still
believe you.
one. There is still one question, so I want to make sure I cover that, which is, could you use this with no framework at all? Yes, totally. In fact, we have demos and examples all on our docs that cover how to do something in a in a framework specific context, so Angular, React, and Vue, but then also with just a script tag and the element on the page. So a lot of opportunities here to do stuff without a framework. You do not need to use a framework. So if you work in a larger organization, I would argue that maybe you should. But if it's just yourself and it's a demo project or your own thing, no framework is needed. I will say that if you do have any questions along this way, we have a whole dedicated forum and then our own dedicated Discord. All the cool kids apparently are on Discord these days, so you can join our forum and our Discord, which is super cool.
Discord.gg/upribisnet.
Or ionic.link/Discord. Some of us didn't update our slides, apparently. But yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. That was amazing. And remember, everyone, if you want to follow Mike, you can always find him on Twitter at mhartington. Is your Beard account still active?
I believe it pivoted to a top knot handle when my hair was super long and I could put it up in a bun. But the Beard account should be coming back soon. I don't know who runs the Beard account, so I might have to just tag them.
Well, thank you again so much, Mike. And yeah, I know you do a lot of stuff for the community. So, I mean, the Ionic community is amazing. And that's one of the main determinations when I choose something to use. So hit Mike up. He's always nice. He's a nice person. Join their Discord. And thanks so much, everyone.